Hello and welcome. I'm Thomas Porteous and you're watching the World Report on NewsX World. Let's take a look at some of the top headlines of the hour. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth says 6 people were killed in 2 US strikes on suspected drug-running boats in the Eastern Pacific. The attacks raised the death toll from Washington's controversial anti-narcotics campaign to 76. A French judge has ordered the release of former President Nicolas Sarkozy after 20 days in jail over alleged Libyan campaign funding. Prosecutors supported his request for freedom ahead of an upcoming appeals trial. Syrian President Ahmed al-Shara is set to meet US President Donald Trump in the first ever White House visit by a Syrian leader. Talks will focus on security and Shara's push to lift seizure sanctions. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer says he supports a strong, independent BBC amid turmoil over the editing of a Trump speech. His spokesman said impartial journalism is vital in an age of disinformation and that errors must be corrected promptly. Gaza's health ministry says it has received the bodies of 15 Palestinian prisoners from Israel through the Red Cross. Officials say a total of 315 bodies have now been returned under the US-brokered ceasefire deal. South Korea's special prosecutor has indicted former President Yoon Suk-yeol on new charges of abuse of power and aiding an enemy state. Prosecutors allege Yoon sought to stir conflict with North Korea to justify imposing martial law. The Kremlin says it is actively preparing for President Vladimir Putin's visit to India next month. Spokesman Dmitry Peskov said Moscow expects the December trip to be substantive, marking Putin's first visit since 2021. China has lifted export controls on car chipmaker Nexperia and paused bans on key semiconductor materials to the United States. Beijing says the move, part of a deal with Washington, aims to stabilize trade after recent agreements to cut tariffs. For our top story of the hour, we start in the United Kingdom, where the British Broadcasting Corporation has issued an apology after a speech by Donald Trump was edited in an episode of Panorama. In a letter to the Culture, Media and Sport Committee of MPs, BBC Chairman Samir Shah said it would have been better to take more formal action after it was revealed the corporation edited a Trump speech. The concerns regard clips spliced together from sections of the US president's speech on January the 6th of 2021. To make it appear, he told supporters he was going to walk to the US Capitol with them to, quote, fight like hell. Trump responded to the pair's resignations last night, describing Tim Davie and Deborah Turnus as very dishonest people who tried to step on the scales of a presidential election in a Truth Social. The concerns about the Trump documentary edit first came to light in a leaked memo from Michael Prescott, a former journalist and independent advisor to the BBC's editorial guidelines and standards board. Before we begin our discussion on this, let's take a look at the core issue at hand, which is President Trump's speech on January the 6th and how the BBC then aired it on Panorama. Okay, we are now looking at the quotes, as you can see, vastly different. Of course, the main difference is, of course, where it says, we're going to cheer on our brave senators, congressmen and women, as opposed to we're going to walk down to the Capitol, I'll be there with you and fight like hell. Of course, what followed was the January the 6th insurrection of 2021. Okay, now joining us is Ross Feingold. He's a political analyst and he joins us from Taipei in Taiwan. Ross, thank you very much for joining us here on the programme. Ross, of course, we've heard statements coming out of the BBC from all over the organisation apologising profusely about this incident. The BBC chair has, of course, apologised, but also has said that there is no institutional bias within the BBC. How far do these apologies go in repairing the broadcaster's damaged credibility now?
It goes nowhere with tens of millions of Americans who support President Trump. And it's certainly not going to make a difference with President Trump himself or his administration. They're going to remember this incident, and it's going to be a factor in U.S.-UK relations, at least for the near term. Of course, the Prime Minister himself is not directly responsible for this, but again, it reflects poorly on British institutions and government-linked institutions. And ultimately, it's just so stupid, because if they wanted to criticize President Trump and what he said that day, then they could have just ran the video as President Trump actually delivered his remarks, and then found a journalist or a commentator who doesn't like President Trump to criticize him. So they just look so silly. And to make this even worse, it's not the first recent incident at the BBC. This is an organization that for decades was highly respected, both domestically in the UK as well as around the world. But in recent decades, they've had repeated incidents of poor reporting that's been questioned legitimately, and other bad behavior by staff and on-air personalities. And they just can't seem to fix the problems with their internal culture.
Yeah, indeed, Ross. Of course, 2 senior resignations followed the highlighting of the edit. Does this expose some deeper systemic bias here?
It's certainly conservatives in the United States, or as they do with a lot of mainstream media, feel that there is bias, whether that's domestic U.S. mainstream media or international or foreign from the United States, so media outside the United States. Conservatives in the United States and conservatives in Europe and other countries or parts of the world also feel that mainstream media and institutions like the BBC are considered mainstream media. And the perception is that mainstream media is very unfair to conservative viewpoints. And frankly, incidents like this prove that. And it's up to these institutions to prove that they could be unbiased in their reporting. And often they're simply not doing that. And one of the unfortunate outcomes of this is people stop believing in mainstream media and they go to the extremes, whether that's on the left or the right. But then they start going to more extreme media, which has its own biases, but people get frustrated with the mainstream media and they seek alternatives.
Yeah, and of course, as you've said, Ross, the BBC has seen a flurry of scandals within the past decade or so. You can look at Hugh Edwards, that scandal. You can look at these 2 instances where Gaza documentaries have been under controversy at the BBC. The institution that is the BBC preaches impartiality. Moving into the new world of media, do you think it still can preach that?
They could try, but they're going to have to try to also prove to the public coming out of this incident that they actually adhere to what they say they're supposed to be adhering to. And given the number of incidents over recent decades, it's understandable that people, frankly, just don't believe them anymore. And it's really sad given its illustrious history. And BBC still does some wonderful reporting. For example, if they're reporting breaking news, there's a natural disaster or some similar incident around the world, they're still very good at that because they have enormous resources and they have journalists throughout the world. But when it comes to analysis of political developments, whether that's in the UK or outside the UK, they do seem to have bias.
Okay, Ross, do stay with us as we have some further news coming up. And we've got a statement coming out of number 10 Downing Street, where a spokesperson for the British Prime Minister's office has defended the BBC against recent claims of corruption and institutional bias, affirming that the broadcaster has a vital role to play in the age of disinformation. The Prime Minister's spokesman stressed that the BBC must maintain trust and act swiftly to correct mistakes when they occur. On whether Sir Keir Starmer believes the BBC is institutionally biased, the spokesperson stated that Starmer does not hold that view. However, he reiterated the importance of accountability for any public service broadcaster. When asked about the future of the BBC licence fee, the spokesman declined to comment on whether it would be reviewed as part of a wider examination of the BBC's charter. We will, of course, bring you all developing updates coming out of that situation as we, of course, get them. Next, more from Europe, and former French President Nicolas Sarkozy is set to leave La Santé prison in Paris later today after a court granted his early release pending an appeal. Sarkozy's lawyer says the next process will be to prepare the former French president's appeal against his earlier conviction. Sarkozy, who was sentenced to 5 years for attempting to secure campaign funds from Libya for his 2007 presidential bid, had been in prison since October of the 21st. The court ruled that he would be freed under strict judicial supervision, including a ban on leaving France and no contact with other individuals involved in the case. Sarkozy, who is 70 years of age, was convicted in September of criminal conspiracy, but acquitted of corruption and illegal campaign financing charges. He has consistently denied the charges, claiming he is the victim of revenge. During the court session, he expressed his commitment to comply with any judicial obligations, describing his time in prison as draining and a nightmare. Okay, we're once again joined by Ross Feingold to discuss the updates from Paris. This former French president has been released from jail pending appeal. What message does this send about accountability for Europe's political elite?
Basic issue here, which is typically people who are appealing a conviction of a nonviolent crime are often released as the appeal is pending, and I think that would apply in a lot of legal systems, so it's really not a surprise that he's been released. But whatever happens ultimately with this case, whether the charges, the conviction is thrown out on appeal or it's upheld and he's returned to prison to serve the remainder of the sentence, there are going to be people on one side or the other who will be unhappy. And because it involves one of France's most prominent personalities and politicians, there are going to be people who are going to say that politics were involved in the prosecution or the judges. No matter how this plays out, there are going to be people on one side or the other who say that the system is rigged, it's not neutral, and people are going to be unhappy with this. And it will definitely cause a lasting cleavage in French society, just like the prosecution of any former head of government or head of state would occur, because there are going to be people on one side or the other who are very unhappy with the result.
Ross, what more can you tell us about Sarkozy, the man who has been sentenced to 5 years from trying to secure campaign funds from Colonel Gaddafi's Libya, of all places? What more can you tell us about the man, the charges that he faced?
Yeah, maybe you bring up the obvious point. Why are you doing business, for lack of a better description, with one of the most despicable people in the world? That's why his own people threw him out and killed him. So why would you even engage in that kind of way and possibly take money from the government of Libya at the time? I mean, that was just foolish. But Sarkozy represented the traditional right of center of French politics in the decades after World War II. So for the 50 years, 60 years after the Cold War period, there was the French left and there was the French right. And really the interesting thing here in the aftermath of the collapse of his political career is that the traditional right, as well as the traditional left in France, they don't have the power or the support that they once had, and voters have moved further to the right and further to the left. And we see that the French parliament is heavily divided. And we don't know what will happen in the next presidential election in 2027. I mean, there are even calls for Macron to resign early. So French politics has become incredibly divided, and those traditional kind of center-right, center-left, and Sarkozy represented the center-right, it just doesn't have the influence that it once did as voters look for more extreme solutions.
Feingold, thank you very much for joining us. Always a pleasure to have you here on NewsX World. We now move over to West Asia for our next story. And Lebanese media is reporting a wave of Israeli airstrikes across southern Lebanon, targeting several areas along the border. These strikes reportedly caused heavy damage in some towns, though there's no immediate confirmation of casualties. The attacks come amid rising tensions with Hezbollah and repeated cross-border exchanges in recent weeks between Hezbollah and the Israeli army. The escalation adds to growing fears that the conflict could widen beyond, with both sides trading warnings and increased military movement. For now, sources say that the situation remains volatile, with efforts by international mediators to prevent a broader confrontation continuing. We're now joined by Major General R.G.G. Davidi. He's an international relations and defence expert, and he joins us live from New Delhi. Of course, Major General, there have been continued strikes in Lebanon by the Israeli army, even since this ceasefire that was signed between Hezbollah and Israel back in November of last year. The situation, of course, does remain volatile. International mediators are, of course, trying to prevent a broader confrontation continuing. What is the likeliness of that happen, and what are the efforts going in by these international mediators to try and prevent things from escalating?
Well, Thomas, firstly, always a pleasure to be on the NewsX World. Well, as far as Israel is concerned, it has been very sensitive to the border on the north since Hezbollah have embedded in the southern Lebanon since 2006, and there have been very frequent skirmishes. The last, the border became very active after the Hamas attack on Israel in October, 6 October 2023. And a day later, this border also became very volatile because after all, the three, terrorist groups, that is Hezbollah on the north, Hamas in the west, and Houthis from Yemen, they pose a existential threat to Israel. Now, there was a ceasefire last year, as you mentioned, I think 27th of November, but this was not exactly a ceasefire. It was a pause because Hezbollah had been reduced or weakened, and therefore they had to come to the ceasefire. But now, as they have gained some more strength, they are very active out there, and Israelis have kept complaining and stating that Hezbollah is trying to fortify their positions, and they have been taking strikes basically to hit the Hezbollah bases. And in fact, since last year, after the ceasefire, there have been frequent violations, almost to the tune of 4,500. So the point I'm trying to make is that this is a very temporary pause, and the border remains very volatile, very fragile, and there have been frequent violations. But the point is that both sides blame each other. Well, the truth lies halfway. I think Israel is continuing to strike at the Hezbollah. At the same time, Hezbollah also is trying to gain strength. So therefore, I feel that this could escalate in case the international mediators are not able to control the situation, because the border is very fragile and both sides are actually very active to gain ground. And I think to that extent, it can escalate in case the international bodies are not able to supervise or control the escalation.
Okay, Major General, do stay with us as we have further updates coming out of the region. And Israel is urging Lebanon's military to take a more aggressive approach in disarming Hezbollah, calling for searches of private homes in the south for weapons. However, Lebanon's military leadership has rejected the demand, fearing it could spark civil strife and undermine its cautious but effective disarmament strategy. Despite this, the Lebanese army remains confident it can declare the south free of Hezbollah arms by the end of 2025 as part of a truce deal following last year's devastating Israeli-Hezbollah war. Recent operations have uncovered over 50 tunnels and confiscated guided missiles and other weapons. But Lebanese security officials stress that the army's plan never included searching private property, and Israel doubts success without these additional measures. Major General Gigi Davidi joins us once again. The likelihood of a Hezbollah disarmament, given the current factors, the current weakness, of course, of the Lebanese government and the assertion that Israel is making on it in regards to Hezbollah?
Well, first and foremost, Thomas, these outfits, the terrorist outfits, they operate in close conjunction with the civilian, habitats or the civilian support, and therefore it's very difficult to delineate between the terrorist organization and the civilian establishment or civilian localities, because they almost merge with the civilians and they operate from there. So it's very difficult to actually figure out as to which are the civilian areas where they have the control and which are the civilian areas which are actually involved in supporting the Hezbollah. And as far as the Lebanon army or the government is concerned, I don't think they have the capability or the will to disarm Hezbollah. So the point is that as long as the terrorist outfit, they mingle with the civilians and they draw support and sustenance from that, as we have seen in Hamas case also in the Gaza, it's very difficult to actually single out the civilians from these outfits. So I think the situation is very murky, it's very complex, and I don't think the Lebanese army or the government are going to come into it or burn their fingers. I think Israelis will be doing what they're doing, and I don't think the Lebanese government or the army are going to come into the conflict, which is directly between Israelis and the Hezbollah. Thomas.
Yes, do stay with us, Major General Davidi, as we discuss further updates from the West Asian region. Iran's Foreign Ministry spokesperson Ismail Baghai has announced that IAEA inspectors visited several of Iran's nuclear sites last week. This visit comes after the IAEA urged Iran to improve their cooperation with the agency. Attending a news conference today, Baghai has clarified that Iran, as a member of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, fully understands its obligations. Briefing on the IAEA's visit, the Iran's Foreign Ministry has said the inspections included the Tehran research reactor and other nuclear facilities. He has further added that IAEA Director General Rafael Grossi has repeatedly stated that Iran's nuclear program is peaceful, with no evidence suggesting otherwise. Let's in fact listen in to the other statement made on the issue.
شخص مدیر کل نه تنها در گزارش‌هاش بلکه در مصاحبه‌هایی که انجام داده، همین مصاحبه‌ای که خیلی اخیر انجام داد، تصریح کرده که برنامه هسته ایران صلح‌آمیز است. هیچ دلیل و مدرکی برای اینکه ایران از مسیر صلح‌آمیز منحرف شده باشه وجود نداره. ما همیشه چیزی که مطالبه کردیم از آژانس و مدیر کل این بوده که بر اساس مسئولیت‌ها و صلاحیت‌های فنی خودش در مورد موضوع هسته ایران اعلام نظر بکنه. از گمانه‌زنی‌هایی که مطلقاً هیچ مبنایی نداره، صرفاً تکرار ادعاها و حدسیات طرف‌های غربی است، پرهیز بکنه. کماکان این مطالبه رو از آژانس و شخص مدیر کل داریم.
Now, according to Iran's laws, the IAEA inspections must be coordinated with the country's Supreme National Security Council due to the challenging circumstances caused by aggressive actions from Israel and the United States. According to Baghai, prior to these aggressive actions, Iran had cooperated with the IAEA. Furthermore, under the Cairo Agreement, a mutual understanding had been reached. Additionally, he has also accused European countries of disrupting the process by misusing the JCPOA mechanism. Major General Davidi joins us once again. Do you think there's a bit of trust being gained between the Iranians and the IAEA here, especially, of course, after those US-led nuclear bombings just a few months ago?
Well, Thomas, definitely there is a trust deficit between the Iranian side and the IAEA, that is the International Atomic Energy Agency, because the inspection of the Iranian nuclear establishment or installation has been a bone of contention. In fact, the Iranians have blamed the 12-day war in June, wherein the Israelis struck the nuclear installation along with the Americans, because they said that the IAEA has actually prompted the Israelis to go in first strike. So therefore, the complaint by the IAEA that Iran is not cooperating, well, to some extent holds water, because Iran has not been fully cooperating or honoring the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action JCPOA, and also the obligation under the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty. And the second point is the Iranians feel that it's a matter of pride and they also have sovereignty. Such inspection must be coordinated with their high command. But the point is that I don't think either side is fully right, because Iranians are not fully cooperating and IAEA also has a genuine concern. Incidentally, while the IAEA has inspected the nuclear installation in Tehran, but they have not been given access to the nuclear plants in Fordo, Natanz, and also Isfahan. So the point is that I don't think that there is a reasonable trust deficit. This has to be built up, and there has to come, more work has to be done from the Iranian side, because somehow they have been putting impediments and also acting as certain blockages to give full access to the IAEA. So until that is done, I think this contention issue will carry on, and especially the E3, that is the French, German, and Britain, they have also been very vociferous that in case Iran doesn't provide full access to the IAEA team, then the sanction will be imposed. So the issue remains quite contentious, and until there is a trust is built up, I don't think this is going to be sorted out anytime soon. Thomas.
Yes, Major General Gigi Davidi, thank you very much for joining us here on the programme. Pleasure to have you on, as always. Israeli authorities are attempting to confiscate 50 boats used by activists in Gaza-bound flotillas, claiming Hamas helped fund and coordinate the attempts. As per reports, 16 of the vessels are owned by the company Neptune Cyber, which allegedly operates under a Hamas-aligned NGO called the Palestinian Conference for Palestinians Abroad. The State Attorney's Office has still not managed to identify the owners of all the ships subject to the request. Prosecutors argue that Israel is authorized to take possession of these ships under international law, which provides for sovereign states to intercept and potentially impound vessels that attempt to breach a naval blockade. Well, that's all that we have time for this hour. Keep watching NewsX World.